Hello and welcome to The Periphery, a podcast from the Pulaski Institution. I'm your host, Alan Elrod, and I'm also the president and CEO of the Pulaski Institution. Today, our guest is Edward Goldberg. Edward is a non-resident fellow here at the Pulaski Institution. He's also a leading expert in the area of where global politics and economics intercept. He teaches international political economy at the New York University Center for Global Affairs, where he's an adjunct assistant professor. He's also a scholarly practitioner at the Zicklin Graduate School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York, where he teaches courses on globalization. He's the author of Why Globalization Works For America, How Nationalist Trade Policies Destroy Countries, and The Joint Ventured Nation, Why America Needs a New Foreign Policy. He's a much-quoted essayist and public speaker on the subjects of globalization, European-American relations, U.S. Russian and China relations. And he has commented on these issues in various outlets and publications like PBS, NPR, CBS, Bloomberg, the New York Times, The Hill, and Huffington Post. Edward is currently working on a book on America's politics and values and the role America plays in the international system, our current role as hegemon, and whether or not that's at stake, but also whether or not the world needs America as a hegemon and the implications that has both for our politics here and the wider system. So I'm really excited to chat with Edward and excited to introduce him here to you. And without any further ado, hi, Edward, how have you been?
Hey, Alan, how are you doing? Thanks for having me on.
Great. Really, really excited to have you here. So I thought that one of the first things we could do is just for you to sort of lay out a little bit of the sort of problem space in the book you're currently working on. And obviously you have a strong background in American international trade and foreign policy. So sort of set the stage a little for some of the questions you're currently wrestling with in the research you're doing.
You know, Alan, I'm writing, or as people who write these things, sorts of things know, probably better word is struggling, to look at the questions. I mean, is America, as our constitutional system is set up, and as our political system is set up, can we be the world's hegemon? The cop, or as Secretary of State Blinken says, the organizer. When we don't know how to deal with the downside of globalization. Globalization is two flip coins. I mean, it's both sides of the coin. The good side is it's just really increased world prosperity. It's taken millions of people out of poverty. It's benefited zillions. The downside of globalization, and forgetting at the moment the cultural downsides and the people have been left behind by globalization, the downside of globalization is the pandemics, economic contagion, global warming. Can the U.S. system allow it to be the leader in dealing with these things? And I think that's a big question.
Yeah, I think that is obviously, I think, a really timely question that sort of breaks into parts, right? Because on the one hand, there's the question of, do we even believe in globalization anymore as a public? But then there's also the kind of question of, even if we do, is America in a position anymore to help drive that process, right? In terms of where our political will is at, but then also I think where our politics has been at. I mean, obviously we've elected Joe Biden, but we just had 4 years of a quite protectionist, anti-globalization administration, and certainly, yeah, that's not gone.
Well, you know, it's interesting. First, I think globalization is it's not a new phenomenon. You know, globalization is Alexander the Great bringing Greek culture to the Asian and Mideastern world. Alexander the Great and having the library in Alexandria. So globalization is not a new thing at all. And I think globalization is part of, it's almost economic Darwinism. And so it's part of who we are as human beings. In my last book, I tell the great story of the tomato, which is really a super story about globalization in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. The tomato we always think of the tomato. We think a tomato is Italian. It's like the symbol for Italian food. But the tomato really originated in the Andes Mountains in Peru. Through the process of natural globalization, got to the Aztec Empire in Mexico. The conquistadors from Spain came and conquered Mexico. They took the tomato back to Spain. Eventually, it gets to Italy, where actually Cosimo de' Medici writes in his memoirs about how there's this gorgeous new ornament for the table, this red fruit. But the Italians, interestingly enough, are afraid to eat it. They think because it's red, it's the devil's food. So it takes another 100 years for them to become tomato sauce. In the meantime, how does it get to the United States, back to the Americas as continent? Thomas Jefferson, our third president, and this great horticulturist, has a friend, a Portuguese doctor, who's also a horticulturist, and sends it to Thomas Jefferson from Portugal for Jefferson to grow it in Monticello. And that's the first time the tomato enters North America, and it's in what we know as the United States. So the tomato is a great example of early globalization. So we can't stop globalization. It's who we are. Now, in the last 20 years, of course, it's been on hyperspeed because of technology and the integration of international finance into world trade. The question is, can the United States be the world leader with what happens to the negative forces of globalization? The U.S. was the world leader in this latest period of globalization because we were the country that had invented really the operating systems, the technology, all these instruments that led to it. And why was that? Partly because our entrepreneurial spirit, partly because in the new world of human capital, we're the country that celebrates entrepreneurialism and human rights, and the idea of fostering this intellectual free back and forth, which creates new ideas. Interestingly enough, and it's pointed out in several books, we also have the protection of law, which helped it, and the respect for law. So the example I was about to give was Eli Whitney when he did the cotton gin. He patented it. The law protected his ideas. The question is asked in one of the great books about international trade. I paused. Did I have to give you the name of the book? On international trade. Why didn't this happen in China? Why wasn't any Eli Whitneys in China? And at the time of Eli Whitney, China was actually a larger producer of cotton than the United States. But once again, it needed people to pick out the seeds. Didn't have the machines. Well, there was no Eli Whitneys in China because there were no patent laws to protect intellectual thought. All inventions went to the emperor. Well, the United States benefits from this in this new era of globalization in the last 20 years, because of our patent laws, because of our intellectual freedom. We really became the leaders in globalization, and it made our economy boom. Now, people got hurt from that because the boom was not even, okay? And there was a lot of discrepancies in the boom. But as a whole, the United States economy tremendously prospered from globalization. Now so that's the good side of globalization. for the United States. The bad side is, the flip coin is pandemics. One can get on the plane from China, have COVID, and have it in the United States in 14 hours. The bad side, globalization, is economic contagion. And the bad side, of course, from globalization is global warming. I mean, and climate change. Canada pollutes, which I really don't think it is at the moment. Instantly, that smoke goes into upstate New York. These are the bad sides of globalization. The question is the United States in the place now to fight it, to be the leader like it was in pushing globalization? I have doubts, and this is the problem. And the doubts are based in what I'm exploring in a couple of chapters in my book, is that our system was invented on the Enlightenment theory. That was the big philosophical theory, as you know, in Europe in the 17th century. And what does that mean? It means the rights of the individual are more important than the community. In our Constitution, our system is based on the government's there to protect the rights of the individual and not to protect the community. You know, if you take the preamble out of our Constitution, which most courts have said is not law, okay? Or basically every court ruling on it has said the preamble is not law. There's not one mention in our Constitution about protecting the community. If you look at European constitutions, whether it's the English Constitution, well, the English is unwritten, but English law, whether it's the Netherlands Constitution, whether it's the French Constitution, whether it's the German Constitution, they all have clauses about protecting different areas of the community. We don't see that necessarily as the right of government to do that in the United States. So in the United States, we can say, who's the government to say we need health care? We can say in the United States, what right does the government have to tell us to wear masks? What right does the government tell us to be vaccinated against COVID? This is a major fault system in our society and in our political culture. Can we change this? You know, maybe the Enlightenment was just a period of time and should not be celebrated. Maybe, you know, Ronald Reagan said the communism begins, I believe his quote was, on the dustbin of history. Maybe the Enlightenment is the same. Maybe it doesn't work with the new threats. And can we change the culture so we can deal with the new threats? And I think this is the biggest problem American society has as a whole now. So
this really gets into a question I wanted to ask you, and one that I think stitches together a lot of the different things you're talking about, particularly with what you just said about sort of Enlightenment philosophy and rights. But even the stories you were telling earlier about the tomato and the cotton gin, right? Because another element, right, of globalization, and that is European conquest, and also in America, the role the cotton gin played in not just perpetuating, right, but like greatly strengthening slave economies. And so I think one of the questions that seems to be hovering around what you're saying right now, and that you're getting at in a lot of ways, is not just whether the United States can become a driving force in globalization again, but can a kind of liberal internationalism in the 21st century be made to reflect those challenges of climate change and pandemics, and also exploitation and extraction? And how do you see this space, you know, yes, as a matter of practical policy, but also I think very much what you're getting at also is as a matter of moral and political theory?
You know, it's difficult. Yes, for sure. You don't know, you do things, and obviously you don't know what the reaction is. Obviously, the cotton gin made the U.S. cotton industry viable. Mm-hmm. And obviously, it therefore encouraged slavery increased dramatically after the invention of the cotton gin. So it had but we can't blame the cotton gin for slavery, and we have to separate that. And so I think one has to become the moral force, obviously, by smart rise in political leadership. And that is the supreme problem. That gets back to Plato. Do we need a philosopher king to be the leader? But on the other hand, as I quote Secretary Blinken again, the world does not organize itself. Someone needs to organize the world. And we look at it both from the pandemic level and from the economic level. There's probably no country out there that can organize the world at the moment better than the United States. The question is the United States up to the task?
I think that's and I wonder this as well, right? Are we prepared for it? Are we ready? And the United States, is the political will there? Right, because and the pressures are coming from multiple directions, right? There's a lot of people. There's the kind of more nativist strain, right, that comes a little bit from the right, that is quite protectionist, that is quite hostile to a lot of the idea of America playing a big role in the world. And then there's the arguments that come more from the left, that is less about necessarily hostility to foreigners, but a kind of idea of, well, it's not our place and we shouldn't be engaging in these systems that are potentially extractive. And I think that creates a bit of a pinch, right, for a lot of people. Whereas there was a time when this idea was pretty popular across both parties, and now there's a substantial kind of push from both the left and the right to abandon maybe not the whole project, but different parts of it, depending on where you stand politically.
Well, one of the things that, I think if we look back in history, one of the things happens in democracies and is that they don't wake up till the crisis is fully in front of them. And this, I've been using recently, I've been talking about it and writing about it. The great example is 1938 in Europe. 1938 in Europe, the Nazis invade the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia. There's a little bit of crying from the UK, but they really did nothing. There's FDR gives a speech. Of course, we do nothing. It's further away than it is, London's closer. Well, that was 1938.
Right.
2 years later, everything goes to hell because the democracies did nothing in 1938. But that's typical of democracies. We don't do anything till we're slapped in the face, because democracies, by definition, are just compromise upon compromise. I'm not arguing for autocracy. That's not I'm arguing for. But it's part of the real problems of democracies, that the only way you really force the various competing groups together in a democracy is at crisis time. But then you need leadership. So we had crisis time in this country a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when COVID first attacked us. And we could have said, we're being attacked by this pandemic. And we could have had leadership. Instead, really, the Trump people blew it. And what was really interesting to me about this, how they blew it, was that there's all these projections of Trump as the dictator, the autocrat. But traditionally in American history, when there was a crisis, the White House would seize power And this time, interestingly enough, Trump gave away power to the states. And he could have led, because he could have said, we are now in a new war, a war against this disease. And instead, he gave up power. He didn't know how to handle it. So I think one of the things is it's very important to have leadership. And we have, of course, climate change is an example of this fuzziness, of this 1938 fuzziness. We don't see, the wrath of God upon us at the moment. Climate change is still, to use the German word, a little bit in the Luft. So it's hard to convince the democracy to unite to fight climate change. Biden's having a very difficult time doing this. I really give him credit. I think added to this, I think the leader needs to be honest and straightforward and tell the truth to the people. Right. Biden has been very good at this. Biden's not, he's not the best guy in the world making circuses, Caesar circuses, to encourage people and get them excited. But he's very good in honesty. And I think that's so important in leadership.
So, I think tying these ideas together, you're describing in a way as the troubles democracy have responding sometimes to big challenges. And in the United States, that can feel particularly acute because we have that system that puts quite a few veto points, right, distributed through our system in order that can make big action difficult. But it also goes, I think somewhat back to what you mentioned earlier, and you said, well, yes, okay, these Enlightenment ideals played a big role in our founding, but perhaps some of them are best consigned to history. And I think that also those kind of dilemmas capture a ongoing public debate that's happening right now, which is that there are a lot of aspects of America's structures and American institutions that need to be revitalized. I don't think many people of a more liberal or progressive persuasion would disagree that we need reform, but there is a big debate about how much, right? Is the reform we need, removing a few of these sort of blocks, the debate around the filibuster, the debate of voting reforms, or do we need even bigger sweeping changes? Things like trying to, get rid of the Electoral College, things like, expanding the size of the U.S. House. And so I'm curious your thoughts on this debate between sort of, how much of the American system still works, right? How much of it still does what we needed to do. Right. And also in the context of what you're talking about, because a lot of times we focus that debate on the domestic challenges, right? Like how much those things get in the way of achieving domestic policy. But they also get in the way of America's ability to be, right, a relatively agile and effective leader on the international stage.
Yes, and absolutely correct. Look, America is a big, complicated place, as you know. Right. America is not Switzerland. America's not Ireland. It's not, Bernie Sanders always used to give the example of Denmark, what an idyllic place Denmark is. Well, Denmark is, I don't know what, 90% homogeneous in this small country, that the United States is this complicated place, many different regions, many different cultures. And so the system has to give room to reflect that. The question is, does it give too much room at the moment? So so obviously in a political culture, it's better to change in a gradualist approach. Doing away with the filibuster is a gradualist approach. On the other hand, if you look at it from a pure democratic standpoint, here's Wyoming with 2 senators, about 1 million people and more cows than people. And here's California with 25, 30 million people and 2 senators. So in effect, of course, the citizen of Wyoming has more power than the citizen of California. Obviously, that's crazy. But to change the Senate system, of course, is a major, radical change, which could only happen if there was the ultimate, and hopefully it won't happen, disaster in the United States, which would therefore allow that change to take place. So yes, I think you have to go with gradual change, and leave that flexibility in the system, because we're not Denmark. But once again, it takes leadership in sadly, it takes a crisis to unite the country. I mean, and I think climate change is the biggest example. We don't have that crisis in front of us at the moment.
Right.
In a democracy, it's hard to organize it without a threat. I think it's, interestingly enough, China has been a gift to Biden.
Right.
Because it gives him a threat, and it gives him a threat to organize around. The problem here, of course, with using China as a threat, do you overplay the threat? Do you think China is a much bigger threat than it is? And once you start the public relations campaign that China is the extreme enemy, how do then you back away from that? And that's a problem.
Right. And I think the other thing we're getting at is this tension between projecting strength on the world stage and projecting values on the world stage. And part of what the pandemic period has afforded to some degree is a lot of skepticism about China's ability to act as much more than an investor. China's clearly got a lot of economic power on the world stage, but I think we've seen quite a bit of frustration and distrust build in the last 18 months or so in terms of the view by a lot of countries on China's role as an international actor. But the United States obviously has quite a bit of work to do, perhaps to rebuild. Obviously, the Bush era was hard for us, and the Obama era, I think, disappointed many countries despite having quite a lot of goodwill at the beginning. And then obviously the Trump administration was relatively actively acrimonious. So I think that I'm curious about your sense of how to place that part of America's role in this context of competition and hegemony, because so much of at least the story we've told ourselves, and I think oftentimes where our policy has been affected, has been about this idea that the United States, unlike many of history's hegemons, has at least attempted to give a nod to the role of political values and not just interests.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And I think we've had. And if you look especially in United States history, after World War II, think about it. When in history has any hegemon allowed their former rivals who they've destroyed come back and encourage them to grow into democracies and actually encourage them to grow into economic powers like we did with Japan and Germany? I mean, this is an amazing feature of the United States system, of the United States policy. I mean, we really did something that was never done in history. We nurtured our enemies' revivals to come back to be full democracies and full economic powers. I think it was wonderful. How to move forward now? It's a problem. One, I think, look, I honestly don't understand the Trump period. I don't understand who gained. I understand that there were these people who I call the refugees from globalization, the people who in the United States who feel they've been left behind by globalization. And they were the natural Trump voter. But interesting, a lot of it is just not so. And here's, once again, we have to tell the truth. I mean, Hannan Hellman at Harvard has done extremely extensive studies that globalization was not the cause of rising income inequality in the United States. I mean, it's fairly proven that that's not the case. Automation, on the other hand, was a tremendous problem. I mean, 20 years ago, it took 10 people to make a ton of steel in the United States. Today, it takes one. Trump argued we have to stop steel coming in from the European Union and China. Well, that was not taking away jobs in American steel plants. It was automation that took away the jobs in American steel plants. So one, he was not honest. But getting back, I don't know who benefited from the Trump system. Yes, the people, my refugees from globalization, voted for him, but their lives were not improved. Maybe psychologically they felt better, possibly, that they could publicly scream where before they felt if they publicly screamed, they would be considered, just whatever. So maybe they got more self-respect. And of course, self-respect is a very big part of politics, the perception of the individual. But did the United States come out better? No. And so I don't understand the Trump era in that respect.
This is something that I talk about with people quite frequently, which it's come up on, I think, on this podcast before, which is there are specific ways, right, in which the late 20th, early 21st century economy cut people out and did create people who were not benefiting as much as they went. But a lot of what is important in politics is perception, right? We had a lot of these reports that came out about status anxiety, more radicalized parts of the country, and status anxiety doesn't actually require that you've actually lost anything to feel it, but the sense that you could, right? And that's, I think, an interesting thing about our moment is I think a lot of people feel very precarious and feel as if at any moment their communities could experience, that loss of status. And that's a really important driver, right? You were just saying, right, that sense of self is that those kinds of psychological factors are just really important drivers in how people respond to politics.
But I also have to blame this on our political system. I mean, and where was, who feels most of what's going on in the community is the congressperson, right? Because they're in office for 2 years and they have to constantly get their contract renewed. My God, if you worked for a university or a corporation and you thought your contract had to be renewed every 2 years, you'd be a basket case trying to, show what you can do. But this is the congressperson, okay? They have to have the contract. So where was the U.S. Congress people in the 1980s, 1990s, when these jobs, yes, initially many jobs did go to China, but then when automation came in and more jobs left, where were they in thinking about ways that the government could help the people who were losing in this situation? There was nothing. There was actually interesting. One major policy, which actually started out with good intentions and turned into a disaster, was Bill Clinton, with our now disgraced governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, who was then cabinet secretary, came up with the idea as an experiment. They're using the Fannie Mae system, that we should let people buy houses cheaply with little or no down payments in order to develop equity. Because the idea was, as jobs are disappearing, here's a way of developing capital. So that was the experiment. George W. comes into office and makes it no longer an experiment, makes it into reality. And I give Bill Clinton credit for making it a trial. And we end up with the mortgage crisis of 2008. But that was actually one of the few tries by our government to help the people who were losing in the system. And so where was if we look at Europe, if we look at Germany, for instance, why don't they have the same problems? Yes, they have some disgruntled people. Every system has disgruntled people, but not at the same percentages as we do, because the German system worked better to help and project and re-educate jobs that were being lost. Our system really failed there.
I think there has been a bit of a national reckoning, right, in the last 5 or 6 years, at least with the stories we tell ourselves publicly, right? Because the initial narrative that really took hold about the mortgage crisis was the idea that people who shouldn't have been lent to were being lended to. And then eventually, right, thanks, I think, to quite a lot of good reporting, and then even just a change in how we thought about our system, you finally started to think more and more about the companies, right, that were taking advantage of people, the level of kind of reckless, right, sort of trading that was happening around these mortgage-backed securities. And like you said, the fact that in the aftermath, there was very little done to come in and address the devastation that hit a lot of these plays in the wake of that collapse. When that system collapsed, a lot of people lost their homes. Right? Yeah.
The idea of having zero down mortgages was an idea to help the people who are losing in the economic system,
right,
losing in globalization, develop capital. That was the Clinton Cuomo idea, but it was an experiment. And then George W. turned it into reality, did away with the word experiment. And the system lost control of itself. Added to that, I can also added to that, it totally fit into the Greenspan laissez-faire economic philosophy. So it was a double problem on it.
I think this gets at something that has felt true to many Americans in conversations about trade, in the conversations about the housing bubble and the crash in 2007 and 2008, and in general, which is that increasingly a lot of people in this country, and I think this is true on the left and the right, feel that the system that we have is actually more than happy to step in and intervene against the market and protect collective interests when those interests are corporations, and that we've started to see the language of corporate welfare discussed quite a bit. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that, obviously I think that that sometimes these critiques can be unfair. Allowing entire industries to fail can be quite bad for an economy, right? I think the Bush and Obama administrations during that crisis were stuck in a very unenviable position, right? Of telling the banking sector to take its medicine could have been devastating for the economy. But there is a growing sense, right? And this ties back to some of the Enlightenment ideals you were talking about, well, there's a lot of individualism when we discuss the market when it's about everyday people. And then quite a lot of willingness to accept policies that frankly can occasionally prop up industries and even in the most basic sense seems contrary to this idea of market freedom in general.
Yeah, look, it's obviously a problem that the balance, and in my sense, the government should be a common wheel balancing these interests, which of course becomes very difficult because of all the power of the interests fighting each other. And so and it also becomes, I was just talking about it with someone before this conversation about, what's politics in a democracy? Politics in a democracy is yesterday fighting tomorrow, and yesterday fights dirtier and harder because they know what they're going to lose. And tomorrow can't even totally define what will happen, how the issues will benefit people.
Right.
So it's always a struggle between yesterday and tomorrow in a democracy. And then the interests of yesterday are huge. And yesterday's interest, can be the Enlightenment, quote, Enlightenment philosophical corporate group until they run into financial crisis, and then possibly they want government help. So it becomes very, very, very confusing there. The issue is also, how does this work out internationally? And that's the problem. We look at the issue of trade. 97% of economists will tell you free trade's a good thing, but then there's the asterisk. Because if you are or the whole country benefits from paying $60, $70 for jeans, or even on sale $40 for jeans from Gap, instead of $270 jeans made here in the United States. Whole country benefits. And in fact, it is an economic stimulus because that differential you can use to buy other things. But if you are the textile worker in North Carolina, you don't benefit at all because you see your job going or your future going. Mm-hmm. So obviously you want stiff, high tariffs. So tariffs is an issue that gets involved with this whole concept of how we see ourselves and the world. And then you take tariffs as an issue for if the U.S. is going to be the hegemon, the organizer, on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact. Obama's plan, brilliant idea strategically. You surround China with economic rules. Really made it sense. If China wanted to continue to be a player doing trade with any of these countries, it had to follow these rules if it wanted to buy in. It was taking George Kennan's containment idea and making it into an economic leveler. And it was really a very smart idea. So what happened to TPP? Then comes Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State, really advocated for it, then becomes a presidential candidate. And TPP becomes this dangerous word because no one really explained what it was. One of Obama's biggest problems, in my mind, I think he's a really good guy, but he would never set the table first before he had a meal. So Obama went to Paris, did one of the really truly basic beginning things on climate change, which is the Paris Agreement. I'm still waiting for the speech explaining to America what he did in Paris. And so the same thing with TPP. He never explained it. Okay. So Hillary's now caught as a candidate because it's thought of as a tariff that's going to hurt people instead of a tariff that's going to help people. So now Hillary, in a debate with Trump, backs away from it. Biden's people now know that TPP is the correct thing. But can they do it? No, because they're caught, because no one explained to anyone what it really was. So this is how tariffs become an issue that even hurt the United States as trying to be an organizer or a hegemon.
I think that's such an interesting kind of double motion or problem, right? Where if you're unable to effectively communicate political problems to your own public domestically, then it becomes much harder to lead internationally.
Absolutely.
And the United States does seem in a moment where we really can't. And I'm interested, I think this offers a chance to sort of turn to, when we talk about globalization, obviously trade is the big thing. But one of the really more unique challenges of the fight around globalization trade in the 21st century, right, is that the conversations that we're having politically are no longer self-contained in different little domestic bubbles, right? They're traveling, right? We see QAnon-driven anti-vax protests in Australia, right? We see people quoting American far-right thinkers in the streets in the UK, right? We see, and it cuts back as well, right? We see these, but essentially that these ideas are able to travel so well that now, in addition to having this problem you've laid out of communicating effectively to our domestic populations, we also have the problem that modern communication and modern the world we live in now has made it to where a lot of the sort of populist and extremist and certainly nationalist politics that are hostile to a lot of these things can travel borders just as quickly as, money and goods.
Oh, for sure. But I don't know if that's a new phenomenon.
Right.
We look at the 1930s and we see the fascist movement in England in the mid-30s.
Mm-hmm.
We see the American First movement in Lindbergh here in the United States. And, the Nazi propaganda and how it was organized was not so much different than what the Russians are doing now or what the Chinese are doing now. Interesting. China, for instance, as you probably know, stopped the importation of some Australian products because Australia was criticizing China on Hong Kong and on how China treated its Muslim populations. So, in the mid and late 30s, Germany was one of the largest markets for the American film industry. And the German government went to Hollywood and told the various studios, if you want to continue that market, you cannot produce any anti-German films. So that it's not a new game. And I think it travels quicker now because of mass communication. But it's an old game.
Right. And I think that is something that has, I think you're correct. I perhaps calling it new was, but supercharged to some degree in these ways that are provided. And, I also think of, you were mentioning, even some of the tactics that were used, right, by the German government in terms of the radio broadcasts that were distributed in the United States, right, to try to influence people in terms of their views on the war and their views on Nazi Germany. And I think this is also actually, right, when you were talking earlier about globalization can create these bad things, and one of them is pandemics, right? One of them is I think we can metaphorically pivot that, right, into, on the one hand, I've always really been appreciative of the movement of goods and people because it also means the movement of ideas, and it can frequently mean the movement of liberal democratic values. But when you allow people and ideas and goods to move across borders easily, you also not unlike a pandemic, allowed the movement of very bad ideas, right?
Correct.
And so I think that gets back into the question we're having about how do we conceive of an international system where prosperity is probably an insufficient goal. Prosperity is great. Trade does bring riches to the world. But what else do we need in the kind of building this international system for the 21st century that's built to sustain not just the challenges of inequity and the how many winners and losers there are, but also the challenges we face of the spread of, frankly, dangerous politics around the world?
Look, I think the spread of dangerous politics it's also part of the human system, because there are always going to be disgruntled people. The question is, how do you not foster those issues? I totally believe, I'm a firm believer, I can look at the downside of Enlightenment issues, but that's only 50%. The other 50%, I'm a total believer of the rights of the individual to move forward, to exchange ideas. And, I look at China and I'm saying to myself, and I said this earlier, Biden, the good news, he has China as an enemy. The bad news is we can overplay China as an enemy. And I believe China will not be as successful in the future as it has been in the past. For many reasons, but one of the reasons is the intellectual freedom issue. When I had last year during the heyday of COVID, I was in a program where I was had to lecture to some Chinese students in Beijing, and I asked them to do a paper. And the paper was late, and I asked them to rewrite it. They couldn't do the rewrites because the program hadn't negotiated with the government for the students to have extended periods on the internet. And, if they can't have freedom of ideas, if they can't have that back and forth of challenging ideas, how does, in the age of human knowledge, how does that culture move forward? It obviously, in autocracies, if you're talking about in a manufacturing age, it was easy for the Soviet Union to put 5,000 people making steel in a factory. But that's different than that age. We are no longer in the manufacturing age. We're in the age of human capital, where you need the interchange back and forth. Interesting, in a lot of discussions, originally Route 128 between Harvard and Cambridge was the home of the U.S. tech industry, and it moved to California, forgetting the weather in the Bay Area, forgetting the great food in the Bay Area. One of the reasons people have theorized that it moved was because in California, it was culture, you could exchange ideas better, because you could go to Saturday to your kid's Little League game. You work for Apple, your friend works for Google. You could say, hey, I have this idea, what do you think? And then getting back to my Eli Whitney example, once the idea goes like that, then you could patent it. But that's the free exchange of ideas is everything, I think, in our world today. And I think the fact that China limits that is a huge problem. It's one of the, one of the list of problems that China has, but I think it's huge.
This gets into, I think, maybe a good sort of closing set of thoughts, which is it touches very much on part of why the Pulaski Institution is so concerned with heartland areas, because one of the things that is happening, right, is alongside things like you've discussed in automation, is brain drain. And as you see on the one hand, the forces that might drive that kind of concentration of people and ideas and really energy and vitality in places like the Bay Area. You also see places where the opposite is happening. And I think that's one of the challenges we have, is sort of how to build other centers of that kind of energy and life and activity that's able to sustain, not just economic growth, but a sense, right, of that really gets at the vibrancy of liberal democratic life at its core.
Oh, I totally agree with you. And, Paul Krugman, for his Nobel, wrote about economic geography and wrote about the idea of clusters. And clusters develop and they become like money-making machines, and they just grow and grow. So the Bay Area is a cluster. The New York metropolitan area is a cluster. And what happens, the clusters suck the best and brightest from other areas. So, one could say, look at the opioid epidemic in the Midwest. Well, the best and brightest, the high school football star might not be the best and brightest, and the best and brightest leaves. And what happens, the high school football star stays there with a very low-paying job because the AI and automation took all the reasonable jobs. Mm-hmm. And so that is a huge problem. Paul Collier, the economist, talked about that was what the Brexit vote was about. He talked about it was the cool people versus the non-cool people. The cool people were in London. The non-cool people were in the Midlands. The non-cool people voted for Brexit.
Yeah, my wife and I, we were living in the UK in 2018, and I was at work, which is in the Midlands outside Coventry, and that was the attitude. And it wasn't, I think Americans might think, well, this was just about, politics in the sort of traditional, maybe partisan sense that we often think of our own politics. I had a lot of friends who were Labour voters, relatively progressive, but they voted for Brexit. And it was they have very little use for London. They have very little use for what they see as a Westminster culture. And it's certainly the resentment is strong.
Right. And it's back to Krugman talking about the clusters. And then for how do you foster, as you said, not necessarily clusters, but how do you foster economic, intellectual growth and social satisfaction outside of the metropolitan areas where the excitement's happening? And that gets back to what I said about it's a big fault of Congress not investing in these areas. I mean, just think about West Virginia and Kentucky. Yes, in Kentucky, there is X amount of people still digging coal. Wouldn't it be smart for Congress, and I don't understand why Mitch can't get together with Biden on this, to make Kentucky the climate research capital for the United States?
Yeah.
Why not? Why not? I don't understand. It's a political problem that hasn't truly been, I think, addressed. The only thing that's been addressed is the dissatisfaction of these people, which gets us to Trump or to Brexit. But we haven't addressed this, how to make these people satisfied.
I love that you've mentioned social satisfaction here, because I think it gives us a great chance to kind of come full circle. Richie Robertson has a great new book on the history of the Enlightenment, where he really foregrounds the pursuit of happiness, right, and the idea that this image of the Enlightenment is purely about reason is a bit of almost a hatchet job. That this idea of there's so much in these core ideas of the Enlightenment that actually are about trying to find ways for people to live more fulfilling and satisfying lives. And that is still fundamentally the problem we're wrestling with right now, is how to achieve all this kind of growth and progress and, yes, prosperity, but also deliver satisfaction, because we've seen the political outcomes that happen when people don't feel it.
Correct. Totally agree.
This has been such a great conversation. I have our little chatter sort of parting question. It's just sort of a fun thing I like to ask people at the end. Because Pulaski is rooted in place, and we always bring people on to talk about, we try to have a very place-centered idea of how we talk about the world. The thing I'd like to ask you is, if there's one place, and you can pick where you currently live, where you're from, where maybe you were at school for a while, and it can be as specific as a bar or restaurant, or as general as kind of a landscape you love, one place that if someone was passing through your neck of the woods, and I know in New York, many people come through your neck of the woods, but if someone's passing through your neck of the woods, that's a little different, that's a little bit not maybe the typical place that people might be sent, that you would send them.
Oh, yeah, but it's typically not the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Yeah. It's wonderful.
because it actually defines globalization.
And it is a gorgeous building in addition to housing some phenomenal works.
Right. That's what I would say now.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's an absolutely ideal recommendation. Well, thank you absolutely so much. I think this has been a wonderful conversation. I think we've hit on a lot of great things, and I've learned a lot. And also I think a lot of this has been really reflective of the spirit of what Pulaski's about.
Yeah. And then I think you're doing a great job there.
Thank you so much. We are incredibly glad to have you on board, and thank you so much for doing this episode.
Alan, thanks so much.
Have a happy holiday week.
Same to you.
All right. Goodbye. The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.